Hear what the Lord says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Oh, my people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. Micah 6 involves an imaginary conversation between the Lord and Israel. In verses 1 through 5 that I just read, the Lord introduces his case against the disobedient people of Israel. Verses 6 and 7 record Israel's response as a series of questions beginning with, "What shall I come to the Lord?" With what shall I come to the Lord? And they say, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And Israel's focus is on their external religious rites, and their questions show a progression from lesser to greater. First, they ask if God would be satisfied with burnt offerings of year-old calves, offerings that were required in the law of Moses. And second, they ask if they should bring thousands of rams with 10,000s of rivers of oil. And this offering would be an offering that would have to be made by somebody that was generally wealthy or by a larger community of God's people. They would have to bring all that together and work together unless they were wealthy enough to afford all of that. And then they asked whether they should offer their firstborn sons as a sacrifice for God. They are wondering, will that be enough to cover their sin? And would God be pleased with them then? And verse 8 is what I really want us to focus on during this devotional time. Verse 8, God says, He's told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And this answer is rooted in the law of Moses. He's told you, O man, what is good. In other words, Israel should have already known the answer to their questions. God then says that he did not need or desire their sacrifices or their religious rites. Instead, the Lord wants Israel's justice. He wants mercy, and he wants humility. And so the answer to Israel's sin's problem was not more numerous or more painful sacrifices. The answer was something more deeper, much more deeper than just religious observance. They needed a change of heart. And without the heart, Israel's conformity to the law was nothing more than hypocrisy. They were just following rules, but their heart wasn't really into following God. Unfortunately, God's people, we're sometimes slow to heed the message, to look at our heart, and to truly follow the commands of God. Act justly. Do justice for others, towards others. Would have been understood by Micah's audience as living with a sense of right and wrong. In particular, the judicial courts had a responsibility to provide and protect the innocent. Injustice was a problem in Israel during this time. And then he says, love mercy, which contains the Hebrew word hesed, which means loyal love or loving kindness. And so along with justice, Israel was to provide mercy. And these are both foundational to God's character. God expected his people to show love to their fellow man, to be loyal in their love towards God, and just as he had been loyal to them. And then he says, walk humbly. which is a description of the heart's attitude towards God. God's people depend on him rather than their own abilities. Instead of taking pride in what we bring to God, we humbly recognize that no amount of personal sacrifice can replace a heart that's committed to justice and that's committed to love. And so Israel's rhetorical questions had a three-part progression, and verse 8 contains a similar progression. We see that the response of a godly heart is outward as we do justice. It's also inward as we love mercy, and it's upward as we walk humbly with our God. And so the message of Micah is still pertinent today, and it's possible that you've seen it a lot shared on social media over the last week or so. It's still something that we need to consider. It's still something that we read in the Old Testament, and sometimes we're like, well, that doesn't really apply to us, but it does. Religious rites, no matter how extravagant, can never compensate for a lack of love. God's people today should continue to desire justice, desire mercy, and be humble before God. It's not about doing simply what is right and avoiding what is wrong. It's about having a humble heart and attitude towards what God expects of his people.